Some women discover their husband's betrayal through lipstick on a collar or a strange receipt in a pocket. But Ava Gardner found hers stuck to the underside of her car at 2 a.m, when sleep wouldn't come and the walls felt like they were closing in. She walked outside in bare feet, needing air that didn't smell like Jim's cologne and the lavender detergent he insisted they use. And she sat on the cold driveway concrete, looking at stars she couldn't name. Her hand reached under the bumper without thought, just needing something to hold onto in the dark. And her fingers brushed metal that didn't belong there. The device came free with a magnetic pop that sounded like a bone breaking. It sat in her palm, blinking red, smaller than she imagined, black and ordinary and devastating. Ava turned it over slowly, seeing the brand name she didn't recognize, the serial number that meant nothing, the little lens that had been watching her drive everywhere, thinking she was alone. The night air turned sharp in her lungs. 12 years of marriage recontextualized between one heartbeat and the next. Every strange comment Jim made about her being late suddenly made sense. Every time he knew where she'd been before she mentioned it. Every casual question about who she had lunch with or which route she took home. He hadn't been interested. He'd been checking his answers against tracked data, testing her for lies, treating her like a suspect in a crime that existed only in his mind. Ava looked up at their bedroom window where Jim slept peacefully, snoring probably, dead to the world, while she sat in the driveway holding evidence of his sickness. Something inside her chest that had been soft and forgiving calcified into something diamond hard. She would not cry. She would not storm upstairs and throw the device at his head and scream until the neighbors called. She would not give him the satisfaction of her pain. She would become the hunter. Ava walked back into the house on silent feet, placed the tracker on the kitchen counter and opened her laptop. For 3 hours, she researched GPS tracking devices, while Jim slept upstairs, dreaming whatever dreams men who hunt their wives have. She learned that this model stored location history for 2 months. She learned that it sent updates constantly. She learned that it was illegal in their state to track a spouse without consent. She learned that the device in her kitchen held 2 months of her life mapped out in coordinates, a digital record of her complete innocence that Jim had been studying like a detective looking for cracks in an alibi. Dawn came grey through the kitchen windows. Ava made coffee with steady hands and started making lists. She wrote down every time Jim had known something he shouldn't have known, every coincidental appearance at a store where she was shopping, every perfectly timed phone call when she was running late. The list filled 2 pages and painted months of surveillance. Her stomach turned thinking about him watching a screen showing her location dot moving through the city, imagining affairs that didn't exist, building cases against her in his mind while she'd been buying groceries and getting oil changed and living her completely faithful life. At dawn, Ava carefully reattached the tracker to the underside of her car, exactly where she'd found it. Jim couldn't know that she knew, not yet. She showered and dressed for work in a black shirt that made her feel powerful. When Jim came downstairs rubbing sleep from his eyes, she kissed him good morning, and he smiled and asked if she slept well, and she said yes, perfectly, lying to his face the way he'd been lying to hers for months. "I have an early meeting," Ava said, pouring him coffee. "I'll be downtown most of the day." She watched his eyes flicker with something. Relief maybe, or anticipation. More data for his collection. "Okay," Jim said. "I'll probably work from home. See you tonight." Of course," Ava said, and kissed him again, longer this time, putting enough warmth into it that he relaxed. "I love you." "I love you too," Jim said, and she heard the desperation underneath the words. The fear. He knew she was slipping away somehow, and he didn't understand that the tracking was the reason. That every time he checked his phone to see where she was, he pushed her further into darkness he couldn't follow. Ava drove to the law office she'd researched at 3 a.m. and told the receptionist she needed to see someone immediately about a divorce. The attorney who met with her had sharp eyes and silver hair and listened without interrupting, while Ava explained about the tracker and showed photos she'd taken before reattaching it. The attorney smiled, and it wasn't kind, it was predatory. "We're going to bury him," the attorney said. "But first, let's have some fun." Ava left the law office with a plan and a retainer agreement, and the first real breath she'd taken since finding the device. She drove to a shipping store and created a new email account using a name that meant nothing. She packaged the tracker carefully with bubble wrap and a prepaid return label, and a note written in handwriting Jim wouldn't recognize. The note said simply, "Keep this moving around the city for 2 weeks. Ship it back and forth between these addresses, payment included." She listed 5 addresses in Toronto and Vancouver and included enough money that whoever received it wouldn't ask questions. She shipped the box overnight to a curator she'd met once at a conference, someone who owed her a favor and wouldn't think twice about a strange request. Then Ava went to work and spent the morning in meetings, acting like her world hadn't detonated at 2 in the morning on a driveway under stars she couldn't name. Her phone buzzed at lunch. A text from Jim asking where she was. "At work," she typed back. "Why?" "Just checking in," he wrote, and she could see him looking at his phone, confused, seeing her location sitting exactly where she said, while his tracker said something impossible. The next morning, Ava checked the tracking number. Her package had arrived in Canada. Somewhere in Toronto, her tracker was beginning its journey. She made breakfast and Jim came down looking exhausted, and when he checked his phone over coffee, she watched his face drain of color. "Everything okay?" she asked sweetly. "Yeah," Jim said, but his hand shook holding his mug. "Just work stuff." Ava smiled and ate her eggs and thought about him watching her location dot appear in another country, trying to understand how that was possible when she sat right across from him eating breakfast, like nothing had changed. She thought about him checking the tracker on the car and finding it still there, magnetic and attached, which meant either the device was broken or something impossible was happening. At noon, she drove to Jim's office building downtown. She'd never visited him at work unannounced, always respected his professional space, but today she walked into the lobby in her best dress and heels that clicked authority against marble. The receptionist looked up and Ava smiled brightly. "I'm here to surprise my husband for lunch," she said loudly, loud enough that his co-workers near the elevators could hear. "Jim Martin. Could you call him down?" The receptionist made the call and Ava waited, watching the elevator numbers descend. When the doors opened, Jim stepped out looking panicked, eyes wild, and Ava crossed the lobby and kissed him full on the mouth in front of his co-workers. She felt him freeze against her, felt the terror in his body, and when she pulled back, she smiled like nothing was wrong. "Surprise, baby," she said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought we could grab lunch. I wasn't expecting you," Jim stammered, looking at his co-workers who were watching with interest. "That's what makes it a surprise," Ava said, linking her arm through his. "Come on, there's that Thai place around the corner." She walked him out of the building and felt him shaking. His phone was probably in his pocket, showing her location in Vancouver, while she stood pressed against his side in the physical world. She led him to the restaurant and ordered spring rolls and pad thai, and made conversation about nothing while he barely touched his food. "You seem distracted," Ava said. "Is something wrong?" "No," Jim said too quickly. "Just busy with work." "I do," Ava said, and squeezed his hand across the table. "I'm lucky to have such a hard-working husband. Some women don't even know where their husbands are during the day." She watched him swallow hard and excuse himself to the bathroom. She knew he was in there checking his phone, trying to reconcile the impossible data with the reality of her sitting in a restaurant eating Thai food. When he came back, his eyes were red, and she pretended not to notice. That night, Jim's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Ava was in the kitchen pretending to chop vegetables for dinner, but really watching his face as he answered. She heard him say hello, heard him go quiet, heard him say something about a lost item and wrong address. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "Who was that?" Ava asked, knowing exactly who it was. "Wrong number," Jim said. Ava set down her knife and walked over to him. She put her hand on his cheek and looked into his lying eyes and smiled. "You know you can tell me anything, right? We don't keep secrets from each other." Jim's face crumpled, and for a second she thought he might confess everything, might pull the tracker from his pocket and beg forgiveness. But instead he just nodded and kissed her forehead and said he knew. They didn't keep secrets. They never had. Ava went back to chopping vegetables and hummed under her breath. The call had been perfect, arranged through connections, someone willing to make an official-sounding call about a GPS device found attached to a university shuttle bus. Later that week, Ava went to their bank and on impulse asked the teller if she could see a list of all accounts and cards attached to their names. The teller pulled up the information, and Ava's blood went cold. There was a credit card she'd never opened, never signed for, issued months ago with her name, but an address she didn't recognize. "Can I get statements for this card?" Ava asked, keeping her voice steady. The teller printed them, and Ava sat in her car reading through months of transactions. Jim had been tracking her spending, watching where she bought coffee and gas, looking for evidence of affairs in Starbucks receipts and grocery store purchases. He'd opened a credit card in her name, which was identity fraud, which was illegal, which was another weapon in the arsenal she was building. Ava drove home and said nothing. She reported the fraudulent card to the bank's fraud department, and within hours they called Jim, asking why his wife was disputing charges he'd authorized. She listened from the next room as he stammered explanations, heard him promise to sort it out. When he hung up, she walked in smiling. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," Jim said. "Just some bank confusion." "Oh, good," Ava said. "I'd hate to think someone was stealing our identity. You know that's a crime, right?" Jim's face went white. The following evening, she invited Jim's brother to dinner, the one who worked at the electronics store, the one who'd probably sold Jim the tracker. She cooked his favorite meal and opened expensive wine, and was charming and warm. Over dessert, she mentioned that her car had been making strange rattling sounds underneath. "Like something's loose under there," she said. Watching Jim's brother shift in his seat, Jim dropped his fork, and it clattered against his plate. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jim's brother said. "Not meeting her eyes?" "Maybe," Ava said. "But you work with electronics, right? At that store downtown? Do you sell car things? Like GPS devices or tracking equipment?" The table went silent. Jim's face drained of blood. His brother coughed and said yes, they sold those things, for fleet management mostly. "Interesting," Ava said, sipping her wine. "I've been thinking about getting one for my mother's car. She's getting older, and I worry about her driving alone. Would you recommend a particular brand?" "I could recommend something," Jim's brother said, looking at Jim, who was staring at his plate like it might save him. "Perfect," Ava said, smiling brilliantly. "Maybe Jim and I will stop by your store this weekend." "Right, honey?" Jim managed to nod. Ava cleared the plates and brought out coffee, and watched both men squirm through the rest of the evening. Jim knowing that she knew, his brother knowing that Jim was caught, and neither able to say a single word, because doing so would require confessing to crimes. When Jim's brother left, Ava kissed her husband goodnight and went upstairs to the guest bedroom. She'd been sleeping there for 3 days, and Jim hadn't asked why. She locked the door and opened her laptop and added everything new to her growing documentation file. The tracker, the credit card fraud, the panicked phone calls, the complicit brother, the lies. Every piece of evidence organized and stored in cloud storage Jim didn't have access to. She lay in bed, thinking about Jim downstairs, probably checking his phone obsessively, watching her location bounce around Canada while she slept 1 floor above him. She thought about the hunter becoming the hunted, the watcher being watched, the man who thought he was so clever being systematically destroyed by the wife he'd underestimated. Ava fell asleep, smiling, dreaming of all the ways she was going to make him pay. Chapter 2. The Systematic Dismantling. Ava woke the next morning with clarity that felt like sharp glass in her chest. The kind that cuts clean and leaves no ragged edges. She dressed in burgundy, the color of dried blood, and pinned her hair back severe and perfect. Downstairs, Jim was already at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and she knew without looking that he was checking the tracking app, watching her location bounce between Canadian cities while she stood behind him, pouring orange juice into crystal glasses. "You look nice," Jim said without turning around, his voice tight like a wire about to snap. "Thank you," Ava said and set his juice down next to his laptop, close enough that condensation would drip onto the keys if he wasn't careful. "Big day at the gallery. We're cataloguing a new collection." She watched his shoulders tense. New collection meant new donors, meant lunches and meetings, and her location moving around the city in patterns he couldn't predict. She bent down and kissed the top of his head, let her lips linger there while she glanced at his screen. The tracking app was open, showing a map of Vancouver. Her location dot sat at a university campus, blinking innocent and impossible. "Will you be home for dinner?" Jim asked, and his hand moved unconsciously toward his phone. "Of course," Ava said. "Unless the cataloguing runs long. You know how donors can be. They want to tell you the story of every piece." She straightened and gathered her bag and coat, moved through the kitchen like water, and at the door, she turned back and smiled at him. Jim was staring at his screen with the expression of a man watching his sanity dissolve in real time. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. Instead, she blew him a kiss and left, and in her rearview mirror she saw him rush to the window to watch her car pull away, probably feeling underneath for the tracker he knew was there because he'd put it there himself. At work, Ava opened her email and found a message from her lawyer with an attachment. She clicked it open and felt satisfaction bloom warm in her stomach. Her lawyer had prepared a comprehensive document outlining every illegal thing Jim had done, from the unauthorized GPS tracking to the identity fraud to the potential stalking charges. The document laid out a case so airtight that any judge would grant her full custody and financial compensation. But Ava wasn't ready to file yet. She was still collecting evidence, still building her case, still making Jim suffer the way he'd made her suffer by turning her life into a surveillance operation. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jim asking what time her meeting ended. "Not sure," she typed back. "Why?" "Just wanted to know when to start dinner," he wrote, and she could feel the barely contained panic vibrating through the words. "You're sweet," she wrote. "But don't wait up. This might take hours." She turned her phone face down and went to meet with the gallery director, who took one look at Ava's face and asked if everything was all right at home. Ava considered lying, considered keeping up the performance of the happy wife, but something about the director's genuine concern broke through her armor. "My husband has been tracking my location without my knowledge," Ava said, and the words felt like knives leaving her mouth, sharp and clean and liberating. "I found a GPS device under my car. He's been watching me for months." The director's face went through several expressions, shock and anger, and something that looked like recognition. She closed her office door and sat down across from Ava and said very quietly that her ex-husband had done the same thing, that she understood exactly what Ava was feeling. That violation that made your skin crawl thinking about all the times you'd been alone, except you hadn't been alone at all. "What did you do?" Ava asked. "I documented everything," the director said. "And then I took him for everything he had. The house, the car, full custody of our daughter. The court doesn't look kindly on men who treat their wives like criminals." Ava absorbed this, added it to her growing understanding that she wasn't alone, that Jim's sickness wasn't unique, that somewhere out there were hundreds or thousands of women who'd found tracking devices and keyloggers and hidden cameras and made the same choice she was making now. Fight or flight. She was choosing fight. "I'm going to need to travel more," Ava said, "for the new position you've been discussing. Will that be a problem?" The director smiled, and it was the same predatory expression Ava's lawyer had worn. Not at all. In fact, I think increased travel would be excellent for your professional development. That afternoon, Ava stopped by the police station on her lunch break. She walked up to the front desk and asked to speak with an officer about filing a report. The officer who met with her was young and female and listened without interrupting, while Ava explained about the tracker and showed photos and documentation. The officer's expression darkened as Ava talked. "What he did is illegal," the officer said. "In this state, unauthorized GPS tracking of a spouse is a misdemeanor. We can press charges if you want." "Not yet," Ava said. "I want to file a report for documentation purposes. I'm in the process of divorcing him and I want everything on record." The officer nodded and took down all the information and gave Ava a case number and her card. As Ava was leaving, the officer said something that made her stop. "My sister went through this. Her husband tracked her for over a year before she found out. She thought she was going crazy, thought she was paranoid, because how could he always know where she was? When she finally discovered the tracker, she realized she wasn't crazy. He was. How is she now?" Ava asked. "Free," the officer said. "And that's worth everything." Ava drove home with the case number in her purse and a sense of power growing in her chest. She had the lawyer, the police report, the bank documentation, the witnesses. She had everything she needed to destroy Jim legally, but she wasn't done collecting evidence. She wasn't done making him understand what he'd done. At home, Jim had made dinner, actual effort with candles and wine and the good dishes they only used for special occasions. He pulled out her chair and served her food and asked about her day, and Ava played along, told him about the collection and the donors, and made up elaborate stories about art she'd seen. All the while, she watched him trying to reconcile her stories with the location data that said she'd been in Canada all day. "You seem stressed," Ava said, cutting into chicken that was slightly overcooked. "Is work getting to you?" "A little," Jim admitted. "There's been some confusion with the project. Technical difficulties. That's frustrating," Ava said and refilled his wine glass. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's bothering you—" She watched him look at her, really look at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. "Confess or keep lying? Trust or continue the surveillance?" He opened his mouth and she waited, genuinely curious which path he'd choose. "It's nothing," Jim said finally. "Just regular work stress. Nothing you need to worry about." "Liar," Ava smiled and raised her glass in a toast. "To us," she said. "To 12 years of marriage and complete honesty." Jim's hand shook as he clinked his glass against hers. They drank, and Ava tasted victory underneath the cheap wine Jim had chosen, trying to be romantic. After dinner, Jim suggested they watch a movie together, tried to initiate physical intimacy on the couch, and Ava let him kiss her. But when his hands started wandering, she pulled back and said she was exhausted from work and needed sleep. She went upstairs to the guest bedroom and locked the door and listened to Jim pace in the hallway outside for 20 minutes before giving up and going to the master bedroom alone. Ava opened her laptop and logged into the email account Jim didn't know about. She started writing messages to herself, creating a false trail of correspondence with a fictional person named Alex, who worked at another gallery. The messages were professional and friendly, and completely innocent. But she knew when Jim eventually accessed her email, because he would, because men like him always did. He would read into the friendliness and manufacture evidence of an affair that didn't exist. She was setting traps everywhere, building a maze of false evidence that would drive Jim deeper into paranoia while giving her more proof of his illegal surveillance. Every email she sent that he intercepted, every conversation he monitored, every boundary he crossed would be documented and added to her file. The next morning, Ava left early and drove to a coffee shop across town. She sat in the window with her laptop and watched the street, and sure enough, after 30 minutes, Jim's car appeared, parking 3 spaces down. He thought he was being subtle. He thought she didn't notice. Ava finished her coffee and left, led him on a chase through the city, grocery store to bookstore to park to drugstore, running him in circles for 4 hours. She never once looked at his car. She never once acknowledged his presence. She just went about her errands, knowing he was behind her burning gas and time and whatever remained of his peace of mind. At the last stop, a boutique where she tried on clothes for an hour, Ava finally let herself look. She walked out of the store carrying shopping bags and looked directly at Jim's car, made eye contact through his windshield, smiled and waved, like she'd just noticed a friend. Then she got in her car and drove home, and in her rear-view mirror she saw him slumped over his steering wheel, caught. At home, Jim was already there, having somehow arrived before her, despite her seeing him across town 15 minutes earlier. He must have sped home, must have panicked when she waved. He stood in the kitchen trying to look casual, and failing completely. "Did you have a good day?" Jim asked. "Wonderful," Ava said, setting down her bags. "Ran into so many interesting people. You never know who you'll see around town." Jim's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again. "Actually," Ava continued, "I could have sworn I saw someone who looked just like you at the coffee shop this morning, and then again at the bookstore and the park. Isn't that strange? Almost like someone was following me around all day." The silence that fell between them was suffocating. Jim stood frozen, trapped by her words, unable to confess without admitting to stalking, unable to deny without looking insane. "Must have been someone who looks like me," Jim finally managed. "Must have been," Ava agreed, and walked past him upstairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen with the weight of his lies crushing him. That night, Ava lay in the guest bedroom and listened to Jim make phone calls in the master bedroom, his voice rising and falling in distress. She knew he was calling his brother, probably calling friends, trying to understand what was happening to him. His perfect surveillance system was falling apart. His wife was slipping through his fingers like water, and the man who'd thought he could control everything was learning that control was an illusion, that love without trust was just prison, and that the woman he'd caged was made of something harder than he'd ever imagined. Ava smiled in the dark and added today's chase to her documentation, wrote down times and locations and license plate numbers, building her case one piece of evidence at a time. Jim thought he was hunting her, but he'd gotten it backwards. He'd always been the prey. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to show him the truth. Chapter 3. The Empire Strikes Back. Ava stood in the shower, letting water burn hot against her skin, washing away the performance of the dutiful wife, and when she stepped out and wiped steam from the mirror, she looked at her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Harder somehow, eyes that held secrets and strategies. She dressed in navy blue, power and authority, and braided her hair in a crown around her head like armor. Today would be the day Jim's world fractured beyond repair. She went downstairs and found Jim at the table again. Laptop open, phone face up next to his coffee, both devices screaming silent anxiety into the morning air. He looked up when she entered and she saw he hadn't slept. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his jaw he'd forgotten to shave. Good. Let him suffer. Let him feel one fraction of the violation she'd felt finding that tracker. "I'm staying at my mother's house for a while," Ava said, pouring coffee into a travel mug, not looking at him, keeping her voice neutral and final. Jim stood up so fast, his chair scraped against the floor. "What? Why?" "Ava, we need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Ava said, and now she turned to face him fully, let him see the coldness in her expression. "I need space. You can have the house to yourself. Maybe you'll use the time to think about the choices you've made." "What choices?" Jim asked, and his voice cracked on the words. "What are you talking about? If this is about me being stressed lately, I'm sorry. Work has been insane, and I know I haven't been present, but we can fix this." Ava set down her mug and walked over to where he stood. She got close enough to smell his fear sweat, close enough to see his pupils dilate, close enough that he thought for a second she might kiss him, or forgive him, or do whatever wives were supposed to do when husbands fucked up in ordinary ways. Instead, she leaned in close to his ear and whispered the truth he'd been running from. "I know about the tracker, Jim. I know about the email monitoring. I know about the credit card fraud. I know everything." She pulled back and watched his face cycle through denial and panic and something that might have been relief that the secret was finally out. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. His hands lifted like he might reach for her, then dropped back to his sides. Ava picked up her mug and walked toward the door. "Wait," Jim finally managed. "Please, let me explain. It's not what you think. I wasn't trying to control you, I was just scared, and I know that's not an excuse, but please just let me explain." Ava paused at the door and looked back at him. "I'm taking our daughter with me. You can see her when I decide you can see her. And Jim, every word you just said, I recorded it, so be very careful what you do next." She left him standing in the kitchen and went upstairs where their daughter was still sleeping. Ava packed a bag quietly, taking clothes and the stuffed rabbit their girl couldn't sleep without. And when she woke her daughter and said they were going to stay at Grandma's house for a while, the girl just nodded sleepily and didn't ask why. Children always knew when something was wrong. They felt it in the air like animals sensing storms. At her mother's house, Ava unpacked their bags and drank tea in the kitchen, while her mother asked careful questions, and Ava answered with the full truth this time, held nothing back, and her mother's face went through shock and anger and finally settled on grim determination. Her mother picked up the phone and called her father and said something Ava would remember forever. "Our daughter needs us. That man she married turned out to be something other than what we thought. Get over here." Within an hour, Ava's father arrived, and they sat around the kitchen table, and Ava showed them everything. The tracker, the police report, the bank statements, the documentation folder she'd been building. Her parents looked at the evidence, and her father's hands curled into fists on the table, and her mother cried angry tears. And Ava felt held by their fury, protected by their love, in a way she hadn't felt since leaving home to marry Jim. "What do you need from us?" her father asked. "Witnesses," Ava said. "If Jim tries to say I'm unstable or keeping his daughter from him, I need you to testify that I came here for safety, not revenge." "Done," her mother said. "And if he shows up here, he can deal with me." As if summoned by the thought, Jim's car appeared in the driveway. Ava watched through the window as he got out and walked toward the house, with the posture of a man going to his execution. Her father started to stand, but Ava put her hand on his arm. "Let me," she said. She met Jim at the door before he could knock. He looked worse than he had that morning, like he'd been crying or screaming or both. His eyes were red and wild, and when he saw her, he tried to step forward, and she held up one hand, stopping him. "You're not welcome here," Ava said. "Turn around and leave." "I need to see my daughter," Jim said. "You can't keep her from me. That's parental alienation." "That's illegal!" Ava laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut. "You want to talk to me about what's illegal, really? That's the conversation you want to have right now?" Jim's face crumpled. "Please, I'm begging you. Let me explain. I was wrong, I know I was wrong, but I can change. I'll do whatever you want. Therapy, counseling, I'll delete every app and throw away every device. Just please don't take my family away." "You did that yourself," Ava said. "The second you decided to track me like an animal. The second you violated my privacy because you couldn't handle your own insecurity. You want to see your daughter? Get a lawyer. We'll do this properly through the courts. Until then, stay away from this house." She started to close the door, but Jim's hand shot out, stopping it. Not violently, not forcefully, but enough that the door wouldn't shut. Behind her, Ava heard her father stand and move toward them, and she held up her hand again, keeping him back, handling this herself. "Move your hand, Jim," Ava said quietly. "Right now." "I love you," Jim said, and tears were running down his face. "I know I hurt you. I know I violated your trust. But I love you, and I love our daughter, and I'm asking you, please don't do this. Don't destroy our family over my mistakes." "I'm not destroying anything," Ava said. "You already did that. I'm just making sure everyone can see the rubble clearly." She pulled the door hard, and Jim's hand fell away, and the door shut with finality. Through the window, she watched him stand there for a long moment before walking back to his car, shoulders shaking with sobs, and she felt nothing. No guilt, no sympathy, no lingering love for the man she'd married because that man had never existed. She'd been married to a warden who'd thought love and control were the same thing. That afternoon, Ava's phone exploded with messages. Jim's mother, his brother, his sister, friends they'd shared, all of them asking what happened, why Ava left, was everything okay, could they help mediate, marriage was work, and maybe they could work through this. Ava blocked them all except Jim's mother, who deserved the truth because she'd always been kind. She called Jim's mother back and told her everything. The tracker, the surveillance, the credit card fraud, the stalking. She expected defensiveness, expected a mother's instinct to protect her child even when that child was wrong. Instead, Jim's mother went silent for a long time and then said something Ava hadn't expected. "I knew something was wrong. He called me constantly asking if I'd talk to you, if I knew where you were, if you'd mentioned anything about your day. I thought he was just being attentive, but now I see it was something else. Something sick. I'm so sorry, Ava. I raised him better than this." "It's not your fault," Ava said, and meant it. "But I need you to know I'm filing for divorce. I'm getting full custody, and if Jim fights me on any of it, I will press criminal charges for the tracking." "I understand," Jim's mother said. "I won't fight you, and I'll testify on your behalf if you need me to." That night, Ava lay in her childhood bedroom with her daughter sleeping next to her and felt the first crack in her armor. The first real emotion breaking through the cold strategic planning. She'd lost her marriage, lost 12 years of shared history and future plans, and the comfortable intimacy of knowing someone completely. Except she hadn't known Jim completely. She'd known a performance. The real Jim was the man who put tracking devices under cars and opened credit cards in his wife's name, and convinced himself that surveillance was protection instead of abuse. Her daughter stirred in sleep and wrapped small arms around Ava's waist, and Ava held her and promised silently that this girl would never accept being tracked, being monitored, being treated like property. This girl would grow up knowing that love without trust wasn't love at all. This girl would be stronger than her mother had been, would leave at the first red flag instead of after 12 years of slowly boiling water. The next morning, Ava woke to 17 missed calls from Jim and one voicemail that was just him crying and saying her name over and over. She deleted it without listening to the whole thing and called her lawyer to schedule an emergency custody hearing. The lawyer said they could file that afternoon and have a hearing within the week, and Ava said, "Do it. File everything." She wanted this over with quickly and decisively. At the gallery, Ava threw herself into work, cataloguing the new collection with fierce focus. And her hands didn't shake when she handled delicate pieces, and her voice didn't crack when she spoke with donors. She was performing strength so completely that it became real. Fake it until you make it taken to its logical extreme. The director pulled her aside at lunch and offered her the position they'd discussed. Director of the new gallery location across the country. Significant raise. Fresh start away from Jim and his family and everything that reminded her of the marriage. Ava accepted on the spot without thinking, without consulting anyone, just yes, I'll take it, when can I start? "After your custody situation settles," the director said, "I won't let Jim use your career against you. We'll wait until the courts give you permission to relocate. Then we'll move you and pay for everything. New apartment, moving costs, school enrollment for your daughter. Consider it done." Ava felt something like hope flicker in her chest, small and fragile, but real. She could leave. She could take her daughter and her career and her self-respect and build a completely new life far away from the man who'd tried to cage her. She could be free. That evening, Ava received court documents via email. Jim had filed an emergency custody petition claiming she was keeping his daughter from him without cause, claiming parental alienation, asking the judge to order immediate visitation. Ava forwarded the petition to her lawyer, who responded within minutes that she'd handle it, that Jim was making a huge mistake, that going to court would only expose all his illegal surveillance for a judge to see. The hearing was scheduled for the end of the week. Ava had 5 days to prepare, to organize her evidence, to build her case. She spent those days in her mother's house, going through every document, every photo, every piece of proof. She created a timeline of Jim's surveillance with dates and evidence. She prepared testimony from the private investigator Jim had hired, from the police officer who'd taken her report, from her bank about the fraudulent credit card, from the gallery director about Jim calling her workplace. When the day of the hearing arrived, Ava dressed in grey, professional and neutral, and walked into the courthouse with her lawyer and her documentation folder. Jim was already there with his lawyer, looking destroyed, but trying to hold himself together. They didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, just sat on opposite sides of the courtroom waiting for the judge. When the judge entered, they all stood, and then sat again, and the judge looked at the emergency petition and asked Jim's lawyer to present their case. The lawyer talked about Ava suddenly leaving without warning, refusing to let Jim see his daughter, cutting off all contact. Made it sound like Ava was vindictive and cruel. Made Jim sound like a victim. Then the judge turned to Ava's lawyer and asked for her response. Ava's lawyer stood and said just 4 words that changed everything. "We have evidence, Your Honor." Chapter 4. The Professional Devastation. The courtroom was small and beige and smelled like old wood polish and broken dreams. Ava sat next to her lawyer and watched the judge read through the documentation folder, watched the judge's expression shift from neutral to disturbed to disgusted. Jim sat across the aisle looking smaller with each page the judge turned, his lawyer periodically leaning over to whisper something that made Jim shake his head or shrug helplessly. Ava felt power sitting in her chest like a bird about to take flight. The judge finally looked up and spoke directly to Jim, ignoring his lawyer completely. "Mr. Martin, did you place a GPS tracking device on your wife's vehicle without her knowledge or consent?" Jim's lawyer started to answer, but the judge held up one hand. "I'm asking your client directly, Mr. Martin." "Yes," Jim said, his voice barely audible, "but I can explain why I thought it was necessary." "I don't need explanations," the judge said. "Did you open a credit card in your wife's name without her permission or knowledge?" "Yes, but that was just to monitor household expenses and make sure we weren't overspending." "Did you access your wife's email account without permission?" Jim hesitated. His lawyer whispered something urgent. Jim looked at Ava for the first time since the hearing started, and she stared back without expression, without mercy, waiting for him to lie under oath or tell the truth that would destroy him. "Yes," Jim finally said. The judge set down the documentation folder and looked at Jim like he was something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Mr. Martin, what you did is illegal. GPS tracking without consent is a misdemeanor in this state. Identity fraud is a felony. Unauthorized access to electronic communications is a federal crime. Your wife would be well within her rights to press criminal charges against you. The fact that she hasn't yet suggests remarkable restraint on her." "What?" Jim's lawyer tried to interject. Something about marriage stress and reconciliation. But the judge cut her off with a, "Look, your emergency custody petition is denied," the judge said. "Mrs. Martin is granted temporary full custody pending further proceedings. Mr. Martin, you will have supervised visitation twice a week for 2 hours each visit. A court-appointed supervisor will be present at all times. You will complete a psychological evaluation and attend mandatory counseling. You will have no direct contact with Mrs. Martin except through your attorneys or a court-approved mediation platform. Do you understand?" "Your Honor, please," Jim said, standing up, his voice breaking. "She's my daughter. I love my daughter. I made mistakes with my wife, but I've never done anything wrong to my child. "You used your child as a spy," the judge said flatly. "According to Mrs. Martin's testimony, you questioned your daughter about her mother's whereabouts and activities. That's parental manipulation. That's using a child as a weapon in marital conflict. You will be lucky if I don't order a full custody evaluation." "Sit down, Mr. Martin." Jim sat. The fight went out of him visibly, shoulders caving inward, face crumbling. Ava watched without satisfaction or guilt. Just watched like she was observing something happening to someone else in another courtroom, in another life. The judge signed several documents and handed them to the clerk, and then addressed both lawyers. "We'll reconvene in 6 weeks for a full custody hearing. In the meantime, Mr. Martin will comply with all the conditions I've outlined, or I'll hold him in contempt. Mrs. Martin, you have my permission to relocate out of state for employment purposes, provided you establish a clear visitation schedule and maintain it consistently. Are we clear?" Both lawyers said yes, and the judge stood and left, and the hearing was over. Ava gathered her things and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Jim. And in the hallway, her lawyer hugged her and said that went better than expected. The judges rarely granted relocation permission so quickly. That Jim's illegal surveillance had basically guaranteed Ava would get everything she asked for. "What happens if he presses charges?" Ava asked. "If he tries to claim I abandoned him or kidnapped our daughter?" "He won't," her lawyer said. "Because if he does, we press criminal charges for the tracking and the identity fraud. He knows that. His lawyer knows that. He's trapped by his own actions, and the best thing he can do now is comply with the court's orders and hope you don't decide to pursue prosecution." Ava drove back to her mother's house and told her parents about the hearing, and they celebrated quietly. No champagne or cheering, just relief that the court had seen the truth and protected Ava and her daughter. That evening, Ava's daughter asked when she would see Daddy again, and Ava explained gently about the supervised visits, about how Daddy had made some mistakes and needed to work on being better. And the girl cried and asked if it was her fault, and Ava held her and promised it wasn't. None of this was her fault. Adults made adult choices, and children were never responsible for the consequences. The first supervised visit happened at a family services center that smelled like disinfectant and sad desperation. Ava brought their daughter and handed her over to the court supervisor and waited in the lobby for 2 hours. Through the observation window, she watched Jim try to play with their daughter, try to act normal, and she saw the girl's confusion and anxiety at being watched by a stranger while she visited her father. When the visit ended, their daughter ran to Ava and wrapped arms around her waist and buried her face in Ava's stomach. And Jim watched from across the room with devastation written across his face. "I'm sorry," Jim said, and Ava didn't know if he was apologizing to her or their daughter or both. "I'm so sorry for all of this." Ava didn't respond, just took her daughter's hand and walked out of the center and drove home in silence. That night her daughter asked why she couldn't visit Daddy at home anymore, why a stranger had to watch them, why everything felt wrong and broken and scary. Ava tried to explain in ways a child could understand, talked about trust and boundaries, and how sometimes parents needed help learning to be better. But her daughter just cried and said she wanted everything to go back to normal. Normal wasn't healthy. "Sweetheart," Ava said, stroking her daughter's hair, "it just felt familiar, but we're going to build a new normal that's better for both of us." At work, Ava discovered something that made her blood run cold. Her colleague pulled her aside and said someone had been calling the gallery asking questions about Ava, specifically about her work schedule and travel plans, and whether she'd been acting strangely lately. The colleague had thought it was weird, so she'd refused to give out information, but she wanted Ava to know someone was asking. Ava felt fury rise hot in her throat. Jim was still trying to monitor her, even after the court hearing, even after being explicitly told to have no contact. She called her lawyer immediately, and the lawyer said to document everything, get the colleague to write a statement, and they'd bring it up at the next hearing as evidence of continued harassment. But Ava was done documenting. Ava was done waiting for courts and lawyers to fix what Jim kept breaking. She called the gallery's main line herself and spoke to the receptionist, who remembered the calls, remembered the man asking about Ava, and Ava asked the receptionist to transfer any future calls like that directly to her office. Then she called every colleague and professional contact Jim knew about and told them the same thing. If anyone calls asking about me, send them to me directly. She was setting a trap, and she hoped Jim was stupid enough to walk into it. That evening, Ava went to the gallery for an opening, a showing of contemporary sculpture that had drawn collectors from across the region. She wore black and red and looked like victory. And when she saw Jim's sister in the crowd, she almost turned around and left. But then she remembered she'd done nothing wrong. She had every right to be in her own professional space. So she walked right up to Jim's sister and said hello, like nothing had changed. Jim's sister looked uncomfortable and guilty and said she came to support the arts, not to cause problems. And Ava said good, the arts appreciated support, and moved on to greet donors and discuss pieces. Throughout the evening she felt eyes on her and turned to find Jim's sister watching her, and finally near the end of the night Jim's sister approached again. "Can we talk privately?" she asked. They went to Ava's office, and Jim's sister sat down and started crying. Actually broke down sobbing, and through tears she said she'd talked to her mother, knew everything Jim had done, and felt sick knowing she'd been part of their family dinners and holiday celebrations while her brother was abusing Ava through surveillance. "I'm so sorry," Jim's sister said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't ask better questions when you started acting distant. I'm sorry my brother turned out to be someone capable of this. It's not your fault," Ava said, and meant it. "Jim made his choices. You didn't make them for him. He's falling apart," Jim's sister said. "I don't know if you care or want to know, but he's barely functioning. Not going to work. Not eating. Just sitting in that house obsessing over how to fix this. Our mother is worried he might hurt himself." Ava felt something twist in her chest, some small remaining piece of compassion for the man Jim used to be before the sickness took over. But then she remembered finding the tracker at 2 a.m, remembered the violation, remembered months of her life being watched and analyzed and suspected, and the compassion died. "He should get help," Ava said. "Professional help. Therapy and medication if he needs it. But his mental health is not my responsibility anymore." Jim's sister nodded and wiped her eyes and said she understood. And she hugged Ava before leaving. And Ava stood alone in her office, feeling the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained. She'd lost a marriage and a shared future, and the comfortable fiction that she was safe in her own life. But she'd gained freedom and self-respect, and the knowledge that she could survive anything. The next day, Ava received a call from an unknown number and answered it professionally, and heard a voice that made her go completely still. "Mrs. Martin, this is Dr. Raymond from the counseling center. I'm the therapist assigned to work with your husband as part of his court-mandated treatment. I'm calling because Jim has requested that I reach out to you regarding something that came up in our sessions. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Ava hesitated, then said yes, and the therapist proceeded to explain that Jim had revealed something in therapy that changed the scope of everything, something he'd never told anyone before, something that explained the surveillance but didn't excuse it. And the therapist felt Ava had a right to know because it involved her privacy being violated long before the GPS tracker. 3 years ago, Jim read your diary, the therapist said. He found it hidden in your closet and read entries where you'd written about feeling lonely in the marriage and wondering what life would be like if you'd made different choices. He convinced himself you were planning to leave, and that's when the surveillance started, years before the GPS device. He's been monitoring you in various ways for years, Mrs. Martin. The tracking device was just the most recent escalation. Ava stood in her living room, holding the phone, and felt the world tilt sideways. 3 years. Jim had been invading her privacy for 3 years. The diary she'd kept as private therapy working through normal marriage struggles that every couple faced, had been twisted into evidence of betrayal in Jim's mind. Every private thought she'd written had been used against her, had justified months and years of surveillance and control. "Thank you for telling me," Ava said through numb lips. "Is there anything else?" "Just that Jim understands now how deeply he violated you. The work we're doing in therapy is helping him see that his actions were abusive, regardless of his intentions. I wanted you to know, in case it affects your divorce proceedings or custody arrangements." Ava thanked the therapist and hung up and stood very still in the middle of the room. 3 years. The betrayal went back 3 years. How many other violations had there been? How many times had Jim read her messages, or checked her browsing history, or searched her belongings, looking for evidence of crimes she'd never committed? She called her lawyer and told her everything, and the lawyer said this was huge. This was evidence of a pattern of abuse spanning years. This would absolutely affect the divorce settlement and custody arrangements. The lawyer said to sit tight and let her handle it. She'd file an emergency motion to modify the temporary orders based on new evidence. They'd go back to court and make sure Jim understood the full scope of the consequences. Ava hung up and sat down on the couch, and finally let herself cry. Not for the marriage or for Jim, but for herself. For the woman who'd spent 3 years being secretly watched, who'd written private thoughts in a private diary thinking she was safe, who'd trusted her husband with her heart and her home and her innermost feelings only to have everything used as weapons against her. She cried until she was empty, and then she washed her face and went to pick up her daughter from school, and they went for ice cream and played at the park. And Ava held her daughter's hand and promised silently that no man would ever make this girl feel small or watched or trapped. This girl would grow up knowing that privacy was a right, not a privilege, that trust was earned, not assumed, and that love never required surveillance to survive. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. Ava sat in the coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Washington, watching rain streak down the windows like tears she refused to shed. Her lawyer had called an emergency meeting, said they needed to discuss strategy before the next court appearance, and Ava had driven through the storm to get here early, needing time to collect herself before facing more legal battles. The coffee tasted like ash in her mouth, but she drank it anyway, needing the ritual of normal things, while her life continued spiraling into surreal territory. The lawyer arrived, shaking water from her umbrella, and ordered something complicated, before sliding into the booth across from Ava. She pulled out a tablet and started swiping through documents, her face grim. "Jim's lawyer contacted me this morning," she said without preamble. "They want to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" Ava asked. "The court already ruled. He wants to avoid criminal prosecution. He's offering to sign whatever divorce settlement you want. Waive all claims to property and assets. Agree to any custody arrangement, in exchange for you not pressing charges for the tracking and identity fraud." Ava set down her coffee cup carefully, feeling rage bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. "He thinks he can buy his way out of consequences." "I know," the lawyer said. "But here's what you need to understand. If you press charges, this goes to criminal court. There will be a trial. You'll have to testify about everything, relive all of it in front of strangers and media. It will be public record. And honestly, given that he's a first-time offender showing remorse, he'll probably get probation and a fine. No jail time. So you have to ask yourself if the emotional cost of a criminal trial is worth it when you can get everything you want in civil court and move on with your life." Ava hated that the lawyer was right, hated that Jim could commit actual crimes and still escape real punishment. But she was exhausted from fighting, exhausted from being angry, exhausted from carrying the weight of his betrayal. "Tell him I want the house," Ava said. "All of it. I want him to sign it over completely, move out within 30 days. I want full legal and physical custody, with supervised visitation, continuing indefinitely. I want him to pay for all moving expenses for my relocation. and I want him to pay for our daughter's therapy for as long as she needs it. If he agrees to all of that, I won't press charges." The lawyer smiled, the predatory expression Ava had come to appreciate. "I'll draw up the papers." They spent the next hour going through details and logistics, hammering out a settlement agreement that would give Ava everything she needed to start over. When they finally finished, Ava felt lighter, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. At home that evening, Ava's daughter asked about the house, asked if they'd ever go back there, and Ava said yes. Soon they'd be moving back home, and the relief on her daughter's face made Ava glad she'd fought for the house instead of just walking away. The settlement papers were delivered to Jim the next morning, and his response came back within hours. He'd signed everything, agreed to every term, waived every right. In one document, he'd given up his home and his daily presence in his daughter's life, and any claim to the life they'd built together, and all he'd gotten in return was avoiding criminal prosecution. Ava read through the signed agreement and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just emptiness where the marriage used to be. She called her mother and said it was done. The divorce was moving forward. She'd gotten everything she'd asked for. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised her. "Are you sure you want to stay in this town? The gallery offered you that position across the country. Fresh start, new city." Ava sat with the question for a long moment. "I'm taking the job," she said. "I'm moving across the country. I'm starting completely over." The decision made, Ava threw herself into planning. She accepted the gallery position officially, started researching schools in the new city, put the house on the market to sell, realizing she didn't want the memories it held, began boxing up their belongings systematically, keeping what mattered and donating everything that reminded her of the marriage. Jim's supervised visits continued every week, and each time Ava dropped off their daughter, she saw him looking worse, thinner, older, hollow-eyed. His mother had been right to worry. He was falling apart visibly. Part of Ava felt guilty for this, some remaining piece of empathy for someone she'd once loved. But mostly, she felt detached, watching his deterioration the way she'd watch a stranger's tragedy on the news. At one pickup, Jim tried to talk to her, breaking the rule about no direct contact. The court supervisor stepped between them, but Jim spoke over her shoulder, his voice desperate. "I'm in therapy 3 times a week. I'm on medication. I'm doing the work to understand why I did what I did. I'm not asking you to forgive me or take me back. I just need you to know I'm trying to be better." "For who?" Ava asked. "For yourself or for me?" "For everyone," Jim said. "For our daughter. For my family, for you, for the man I should have been all along." "It's too late for me," Ava said. "Whatever work you're doing, I'm glad you're doing it. But it doesn't change what happened. You need to do this work for yourself and for your daughter, not because you think it'll fix us, because there is no us anymore." Jim's face crumpled, but he nodded and stepped back, and Ava took their daughter's hand and walked away. In the car, her daughter asked why Daddy looked so sad, and Ava said Daddy was learning some hard lessons about how his choices affected other people. "Will he ever be happy again?" her daughter asked. "I don't know," Ava said honestly. "But that's not our responsibility. We can care about him and hope he heals, but we can't fix him. Only he can do that." The house sold faster than expected to a young couple expecting their first baby. Ava coordinated the cross-country move with precision, hiring movers and booking flights and enrolling her daughter in the new school. Everything was falling into place. Her new life was forming like a photograph, developing in solution, fuzzy at first, then gradually coming into sharp focus. Jim's mother called, asking if she could visit before they moved, saying goodbye properly, and Ava agreed because Jim's mother had always been kind. They met for lunch, and Jim's mother held her granddaughter tight and cried, and then she pulled Ava aside. "I know you'll probably never want to hear this, but I'm proud of how you handled everything. You could have destroyed Jim completely, but you showed mercy when you didn't have to, and that takes strength. I didn't do it for him. Ava said. "I did it for our daughter. I didn't want her growing up knowing her mother put her father in jail, even if he deserved it." The final supervised visit before the move was harder than Ava expected. Their daughter clung to Jim and cried and said she didn't want to leave, didn't want to only see Daddy on video calls. Jim held her and cried too, and Ava stood in the doorway watching father and daughter grieve the life they were losing. And she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders. Was she doing the right thing? But then she remembered finding the tracker at 2 a.m, remembered the violation and betrayal and years of secret surveillance. And she knew that staying meant staying trapped in the shadow of what Jim had done. Moving meant freedom. On their last night in town, Ava's friends threw her a going-away party at the gallery, and women she'd known for years hugged her and cried and said they'd miss her and admired her courage. The gallery director made a toast about Ava being an inspiration, about choosing yourself even when it's hard, and Ava felt seen and valued in ways she'd never felt during the marriage. Late in the evening, the director pulled Ava aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was a check for more than Ava expected, a relocation bonus on top of the salary they'd already discussed. "You're investing in the gallery's future," the director said. "This is us investing in yours." The moving truck came the next morning, and Ava and her daughter stood in the empty house and said goodbye to the life they'd lived there. Her daughter cried, and Ava held her, and acknowledged the grief while also holding space for the hope of what was coming. They locked the door for the last time and drove to the airport, and Ava didn't look back at the house in the rearview mirror, just kept her eyes forward on the road ahead. On the plane, her daughter fell asleep against her shoulder, and Ava looked out the window at clouds and sky and thought about transformation. She'd been one person when she found that tracker and was becoming someone else entirely through the process of leaving. Stronger, harder, more certain of her own worth. She'd lost a marriage but gained herself, and that seemed like a fair trade. They landed in their new city as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink and gold, and Ava took it as a sign. This was dawn breaking on her new life. This was the beginning of something built entirely on her own terms. Jim's surveillance and control couldn't reach her here. She was finally, completely free. Chapter 6. The Transformation. The apartment was on the 7th floor with windows that faced east, so morning light flooded the living room like a blessing. And Ava stood in the empty space, feeling possibility hum through her bones. The movers wouldn't arrive with their furniture for another 2 days, so she and her daughter slept on air mattresses that first night. And in the dark, her daughter whispered, asking if they'd made a mistake, leaving everyone behind. And Ava whispered back that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is start over. The new gallery was modern and enormous, 3 times the size of her previous space, with high ceilings and track lighting and a permanent collection that made Ava's hands itch to curate something remarkable. The director showed her around on the first day, introduced her to staff who welcomed her warmly, and assigned her an office with a view of the city skyline. Ava sat at her new desk and opened her laptop and got to work. And for the first time in years, she worked without the nagging feeling that someone was watching, tracking, monitoring her every move. Her daughter started school and came home that first week with stories about new friends and different lessons, and a teacher who let them draw during quiet time. The adjustment was harder than Ava had hoped, but easier than she'd feared, and she signed her daughter up for art classes and soccer and made sure there were structured activities to fill the hours after school. Video calls with Jim happened twice a week, scheduled and supervised by the court's remote monitoring system. And Ava sat nearby during these calls, ready to end them if Jim crossed any boundaries. But Jim was different on video. Quieter, more careful. He asked their daughter about school and friends and activities without interrogating her for information about Ava. He talked about his therapy and the things he was learning about himself. He told their daughter he loved her and was proud of her for being so brave during the move. He never once asked to speak to Ava, never tried to manipulate their daughter into passing messages, just maintained his boundaries perfectly in a way that surprised Ava with its consistency. Weeks passed, and Ava fell into new rhythms. Morning coffee, watching sunrise over unfamiliar buildings, walking her daughter to school, through streets that held no memories of Jim, working in the gallery, surrounded by art that inspired her. Coming home to an apartment that was entirely theirs, decorated the way they wanted, filled with only the things that brought them joy. She joined a book club and a yoga class, and started saying yes to invitations from co-workers who wanted to grab drinks after work. One evening at a gallery opening, Ava met someone who made her laugh, a museum curator named David who specialized in contemporary sculpture. They talked about art and their favorite pieces and the politics of acquisitions. And when he asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime, Ava said yes, without thinking, without the panic she'd expected to feel at the idea of dating again. The dinner was easy and comfortable, and ended with a kiss that made Ava feel something she hadn't felt in years: desire without guilt, interest without surveillance, the freedom to be attracted to someone without wondering if she'd be punished for it later. She went home and told her daughter she'd had dinner with a friend, and her daughter asked if the friend was a boy or girl. And when Ava said boy, her daughter asked if that meant Ava had a boyfriend now. "Not yet," Ava said. "Just someone I like spending time with." "Is that okay with you?" Her daughter considered this seriously. "Does it mean you won't get back together with Daddy?" "Sweetheart, Daddy and I are not getting back together regardless of whether I date anyone else. Our marriage ended because of choices Daddy made that hurt our trust. That's separate from whether I meet other people. But you still love Daddy a little bit, right?" Ava sat down next to her daughter and chose her words carefully. "I love the father Daddy is to you. I love the man he used to be before he got sick with worry and fear. But I don't love the man who tracked me and lied to me and violated my privacy. And I can't be married to someone I don't trust." Her daughter absorbed this and asked if she could keep video calling Daddy twice a week. And Ava promised that would never change, that both parents would always be in her life even if they couldn't be in the same room. The relationship with David developed slowly and carefully. Ava was cautious about introducing him to her daughter, wanted to make sure this was real and stable before involving her child. They dated for months, getting coffee and going to exhibitions and spending long evenings talking about everything and nothing. David knew about her divorce, knew generally that trust had been broken, but Ava hadn't told him the full story yet, wasn't sure how to explain years of surveillance without sounding damaged or paranoid. One night over wine in David's apartment, Ava finally told him everything. The tracker under the car, the credit card fraud, the diary Jim had read, the years of secret monitoring. She watched David's face as she talked, watched for signs of judgment or discomfort, or the belief that maybe she'd done something to deserve Jim's suspicion. Instead, she saw anger on her behalf and something that looked like fierce protectiveness. "That's not marriage," David said. "That's imprisonment. I'm so sorry you went through that. Are you worried I'm damaged now?" Ava asked. "That I have trust issues that will make me difficult to be with." David pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "I'm worried that any man who treats you with basic respect and honesty will seem remarkable to you because your ex set the bar so low. I don't want you to settle for normal when you deserve extraordinary," Ava cried then. Actually let herself cry in front of someone who wasn't her mother or her therapist. And David held her while she released years of held-back grief and anger and relief. When she finally stopped crying, she felt lighter, like she'd shed a skin that had been suffocating her. The relationship deepened after that night. Ava introduced David to her daughter, who liked him immediately because he treated her like a person instead of a child, asked her opinions about art, and listened to her stories. They started spending weekends together, the three of them, going to museums and parks and movies. Ava felt herself relaxing into the possibility that maybe this could work. Maybe she could build a new family from the ruins of the old one. But then Jim called on a Tuesday evening, not during scheduled video time. And when Ava answered, she heard desperation in his voice that made her stomach drop. "I need to talk to you," Jim said. "Something happened, and I don't know who else to call." Ava stepped into the bedroom, away from where her daughter was watching television. "We're not supposed to have direct contact outside of mediation. What happened?" "I got fired," Jim said. "They found out about the court case and the surveillance stuff, and they said it was a liability, having me on staff. I'm trying to find another job, but no one wants to hire someone with my record. I can't make my rent. I'm going to lose my apartment. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I'm desperate." Ava felt a complicated mix of sympathy and anger. Part of her wanted to help, because she remembered loving this man once, remembered building a life with him before his sickness destroyed everything. But the larger part of her remembered finding that tracker, remembered years of privacy violations, remembered being treated like a criminal in her own marriage. "I'm sorry you're going through that," Ava said carefully, "but I can't help you financially." "That's not my responsibility anymore." "I'm not asking for money," Jim said quickly. "I'm asking if you could write a letter to my lawyer. Something saying I've been complying with the court orders, that I'm being a good father during visitations, that I'm not a danger to anyone. Something I could show potential employers to prove I'm not the monster the court records make me seem." "You're asking me to vouch for you? To minimize what you did so you can get a job?" "I'm asking you to acknowledge that people can change, that I'm working on myself, that what I did was wrong, but it doesn't define everything I am." Ava was quiet for a long moment. "I'll think about it, but I'm not promising anything." She hung up and sat on her bed, staring at the wall. David appeared in the doorway and asked if everything was okay, and Ava told him about Jim's request. David listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked what she wanted to do. "I don't know," Ava said. "Part of me wants to help, because he's still my daughter's father, and if he can't support himself, that affects her. But part of me thinks he made his choices and needs to live with the consequences without me rescuing him." "What does your gut tell you?" David asked. Ava closed her eyes and listened to the voice inside her that had been silenced for years under Jim's surveillance, the voice that knew truth when it heard it. "My gut says he needs to figure this out himself. That me writing a letter wouldn't be helping him. It would be enabling him to avoid the full weight of what he did. And maybe hitting bottom is what he needs to actually change, instead of just going through the motions of therapy because a court ordered it." "Then trust your gut," David said. Ava called Jim back the next day and told him she wouldn't be writing the letter, that she understood his situation was difficult, but she couldn't in good conscience minimize his actions to make his life easier. Jim was silent for a long moment and then said he understood. He shouldn't have asked, and hung up without saying goodbye. That weekend, Jim's mother called and said Jim had moved in with her temporarily until he got back on his feet, and could they please make sure their granddaughter knew this was temporary, that Daddy was going through a hard time but still loved her. Ava assured Jim's mother that their daughter knew she was loved, but the adult problems were adult problems, and their daughter didn't need to carry the weight of her father's struggles. Months continued passing, and Ava's life in the new city became not just real but thriving. The gallery mounted a major exhibition that received national attention. She was profiled in art magazines and invited to speak on panels. Her relationship with David deepened into something serious and stable and healthy. Her daughter was excelling in school and had close friends and seemed genuinely happy. During video calls, Jim looked better, more stable, and he told their daughter he'd found a job working for his brother's electronics store. The irony wasn't lost on Ava, that Jim was now working at the place that had sold him the tracker that destroyed his marriage. But she said nothing, just supervised the calls and made sure they ended on time. One evening, David asked if Ava had ever thought about getting married again, and Ava felt panic rise in her throat before she pushed it down and examined it. Was she afraid of marriage itself, or just the memory of her marriage to Jim? Could she separate the institution from the trauma? I don't know, Ava said honestly. Ask me again in a year. David smiled and said he could wait, and Ava fell a little bit more in love with him for not pushing, for giving her space to heal at her own pace. That night, Ava lay in bed thinking about the trajectory of her life. She'd gone from tracked and surveilled to free and thriving. She'd gone from doubting her own judgment to trusting her instincts completely. She'd gone from performing strength to actually being strong. The woman she'd become barely resembled the woman who'd found that tracker, and Ava was grateful for the transformation, even as she mourned everything it had cost. She thought about Jim in his mother's house working at an electronics store, and she hoped he was actually changing, actually becoming someone capable of healthy relationships. She hoped he was learning that love required trust, that trust required honesty, that honesty required vulnerability he'd never been willing to show. She hoped it for his sake, and for their daughter's sake, and for whatever woman might love him next. But mostly, Ava thought about herself, about the life she'd built, brick by brick, from the ruins of her marriage. This life was entirely hers, untouched by Jim's sickness, and that made it sacred. She'd claimed her freedom, and she would never, ever give it up again. Chapter 7. The Fracture Point. Ava stood at her office window watching snow fall past the glass, thinking about transformation and things that looked beautiful while freezing you solid. Her phone buzzed with a text from David asking if she wanted to come to a holiday party at the museum, and she typed back yes and added a heart emoji because she could do that now, could be affectionate without second-guessing whether someone was monitoring her messages. The gallery was preparing for its biggest exhibition yet, a retrospective of women artists who challenged traditional narratives, and Ava was lead curator. She spent long days arranging pieces and writing wall text, and the work filled her with purpose she'd forgotten was possible. Her boss pulled her aside one afternoon and said the board was considering promoting her to executive director when the current director retired next year, and Ava felt pride bloom warm in her chest. That evening, she video-called with her daughter, who was at Jim's mother's house for an extended holiday visit. The first time Jim had overnight visits without supervision. The court had modified the custody arrangement after Jim completed his therapy and psychological evaluation, and Ava had agreed to the change because the evaluator said Jim had made significant progress and posed no risk to their daughter. "How's it going with Daddy?" Ava asked carefully. "Good," her daughter said. "We made cookies today, and he let me decorate them however I wanted. And Grandma said we can go ice skating tomorrow." "That sounds fun," Ava said, and meant it. Even as part of her wished she was the one taking her daughter ice skating. After hanging up, Ava sat in the quiet apartment, feeling the weight of single parenthood mixed with the relief of shared custody. She missed her daughter terribly during these visits, but also appreciated having time to herself, time to work late or see David, or just sit in silence. The complexity of these feelings made her uncomfortable, made her worry she was a bad mother for enjoying time away from her child. At David's holiday party, Ava wore green velvet and felt elegant and powerful, and she moved through rooms full of artists and curators, feeling like she belonged. David introduced her as his girlfriend to people he'd known for years, and the word girlfriend felt significant, felt like claiming something real and permanent. Late in the evening, a woman approached Ava and said she'd read about her work at the gallery, about the upcoming Women Artists exhibition, and she wanted to share her own story. The woman talked about being in a controlling marriage, where her husband had monitored her phone and emails and accused her of affairs that didn't exist, and how she'd finally left and was rebuilding her life as an artist. Ava listened and felt the familiar recognition of shared trauma. I'm curating a smaller exhibition next year about surveillance and control in domestic spaces, Ava said. Would you be interested in contributing work? The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, and they exchanged information, and Ava felt something shift inside her, some understanding that her experience with Jim wasn't just personal trauma, but part of a larger pattern, and maybe she could use her platform to shine light on this darkness other women were living through. Back in her new city, Ava threw herself into work, opening a second gallery space and being profiled in national magazines. Her success was its own revenge, becoming everything she dreamed, while Jim watched from the sidelines of her life. One evening, her daughter came home from a visit and asked if Ava had seen the new girlfriend, and Ava felt her stomach drop. What new girlfriend? Ava asked, keeping her voice neutral. Daddy's friend who was at Grandma's house. Her name is Lauren, and she brought pizza and played games with us. Daddy said she was his friend, but they were holding hands, so I think she's his girlfriend. Ava absorbed this information, feeling complicated things. Relief that Jim was moving on. Jealousy that wasn't about wanting Jim back, but about him seemingly getting to have happiness after what he'd done. Fear that he might damage this new woman the way he'd damaged Ava, and underneath all of it, a strange grief for the final death of their marriage. That's nice that Daddy has a friend, Ava said carefully. Did you like her? She was okay, her daughter said. She seemed nice. That night, Ava lay awake thinking about Jim with someone new, wondering if he'd told this woman about the tracking and surveillance, or if he was keeping that history hidden. She thought about calling his mother, but stopped herself because it wasn't her business anymore. Still, the thought nagged at her, until she finally texted Jim's mother asking if they could talk. Jim's mother called immediately, and Ava asked directly about the girlfriend, about whether this woman knew Jim's history. Lauren knows everything, Jim's mother said. Jim told her on their second date. She's actually a therapist herself, works with trauma survivors. She knows exactly who Jim was and what he did. Ava felt some of her anxiety ease, but asked one more question. Does she know about the diary? That he read my diary 3 years before the tracking started? There was a long pause. I didn't know about the diary. Jim never told me that. Ask him about it, Ava said. And if he's not being completely honest with this woman about his history, then she shouldn't be around my daughter. Jim called the next day, angry in a way Ava hadn't heard since before the divorce. You had no right to tell my mother about the diary. You're trying to sabotage my relationship because you can't handle me being happy. I asked your mother a simple question about whether your girlfriend knows your full history, Ava said coldly. If you've been honest with her, then my question shouldn't be a problem. Lauren knows everything that matters, Jim said. Ancient history about a diary isn't relevant. It's not ancient history, Jim. It's the beginning of the pattern. It's proof that the surveillance didn't start with the tracker. If you can't be honest about that with someone you're dating, then you haven't actually changed. Jim hung up on her, and Ava stood holding the phone, feeling vindicated and exhausted. 2 days later, Ava received a message from an unknown number. It was Lauren, Jim's girlfriend, asking if they could meet for coffee. Ava's first instinct was to refuse, but something made her agree. They met at a coffee shop, and Lauren was younger than Ava expected, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and direct energy. I wanted you to hear from me directly, Lauren said. Jim told me everything, after your conversation with his mother. The diary, the tracking, all of it. And I wanted you to know that I'm not going into this relationship blind. Why are you with him? Ava asked. You're a therapist. You must see the red flags. I see someone who made terrible choices because of untreated mental illness and who's doing intensive work to address that illness and change his patterns. I'm not excusing what he did to you. What he did was abuse. But I also believe people can change if they're willing to do the work, and Jim is doing the work. For now, Ava said. But what happens when you have your first fight? Will he fall back into surveillance? Lauren was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Nobody knows that. But I'm going into this with my eyes open and my boundaries clear. And if he ever crosses them, I'll leave immediately. I'm not you, Ava. I'm not staying in a situation that harms me. I know what to watch for, and I'm watching. Ava studied this woman and felt something unexpected. Respect. Lauren wasn't naive. She was making an informed choice with clear boundaries. If you're going to be in my daughter's life, I need to know you'll protect her, Ava said. I promise, Lauren said. Your daughter's well-being is more important than my relationship. If at any point I think Jim is falling back into unhealthy patterns, I'll tell you immediately. They parted ways, and Ava drove back to the gallery feeling like some chapter had closed. Jim having a girlfriend who knew his history and was choosing him anyway meant Ava could finally stop worrying about him, stop feeling responsible for warning future partners. That evening David came over, and Ava told him about the meeting with Lauren. And David held her while she cried for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Maybe she was crying for the marriage that had ended. Maybe for the years she'd lost to surveillance and fear. Maybe for the relief of finally truly being free of Jim and his damage. I'm so tired, Ava whispered against David's chest. I'm tired of being the strong one. I'm tired of managing Jim's relationships and protecting our daughter and building this new life. I'm just tired. Then rest, David said. I've got you. And for the first time since finding that tracker under her car, Ava let herself be held without strategy or performance, let herself be weak for a moment, let herself trust that someone else could carry some of the weight. It felt terrifying and liberating, and like maybe, finally, she was learning what healthy love actually looked like. Chapter 8. The Reflection. Spring came violent and green, everything blooming at once, like the city had been holding its breath through winter and finally exhaled. And Ava stood on her balcony with morning coffee, watching the world transform itself and thinking about cycles and seasons and things that died so other things could grow. Her daughter was sleeping in after staying up late, working on a school project about family history. And Ava had helped her create a timeline that included the divorce and move without shame. Just facts presented clearly the way you'd present any other life event. The Women Artists exhibition opened to critical acclaim and crowds that wrapped around the block. And Ava stood in the gallery watching people engage with the work and felt pride that had nothing to do with Jim's opinion or approval. She'd done this herself. Built this success through her own talent and vision and determination. The local paper ran a feature about her with photos and quotes, and several people from her old city messaged congratulations, including colleagues from the gallery she'd left behind. David asked if she wanted to move in together, said he'd been thinking about it for months. And Ava said yes, without the panic she'd expected to feel. They started looking at apartments with space for her daughter, places with good schools nearby, and room for all three of them to exist comfortably. Her daughter was excited about the move, liked David, and felt safe with him. And Ava felt grateful that her child was learning what healthy relationships looked like by watching Ava and David together. Jim's visits with their daughter continued regularly and smoothly. He'd been promoted at his brother's store to a management position and seemed genuinely happier, more stable. His relationship with Lauren was apparently going well, and during video calls, he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of his past mistakes. Ava was glad for this, not because she wanted Jim to be happy, but because their daughter deserved a father who was present and healthy. One afternoon, Ava received a message from Jim asking if they could talk, really talk, without lawyers or court mediators involved. Just two people who used to love each other trying to find closure. Ava's first instinct was to refuse, but her therapist encouraged her to consider it, said sometimes closure required facing things directly instead of maintaining protective distance. So Ava agreed to meet Jim at a park halfway between their cities. Neutral territory where neither of them held power. He looked different when she saw him. Not physically older, but somehow softer around the edges. Like years of anxiety had finally loosened their grip on his body. They walked along a path through trees, just starting to leaf out, not speaking at first, just moving together through space the way they used to move through their life together. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Jim finally said. "I know you didn't have to. What do you want to talk about?" Ava asked, keeping her voice neutral, not giving him anything to work with. "I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. Not the court-ordered sorry or the sorry I said in therapy. A real apology for everything I did to you, for every way I violated your trust and privacy and autonomy. I spent years treating you like a suspect instead of a partner, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the damage I caused. But I need to say it anyway." Ava walked in silence for a moment, processing this. "Why now? Why does it matter to you that I hear this?" "Because I'm getting married," Jim said, and Ava stopped walking. "Lauren and I are engaged, and before I start a new marriage, I needed to face what I did to you. Needed to tell you directly that I understand now what I destroyed through my own sickness. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I see it clearly now." They stood under flowering trees, and Ava looked at Jim's face and saw genuine remorse there. The kind that comes from actually understanding your impact, instead of just going through the motions of apology. She thought about how to respond, what would give her closure while maintaining her dignity. "I'm glad you understand what you did," Ava said finally. "And I'm glad you're getting help so you don't do it to Lauren. But Jim, understanding doesn't erase what happened. I spent years being watched and tracked and analyzed. Years having my privacy violated in ways I'm still processing. Your apology is noted, but it doesn't change that those years are gone, that trust is gone, that the woman I was before I found that tracker is gone. You killed her as surely as if you'd used a weapon." "I know," Jim said, and his voice broke. "I know I can never fix what I broke. I just wanted you to know that losing you taught me everything I needed to learn, but learned too late." They walked back to their cars in silence and stood in the parking lot for a moment. Two people who used to share a life, now separated by miles and choices and consequences. Ava looked at Jim and felt something like peace settle over her. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance that this was how their story ended. No dramatic reconciliation, no tearful reunion, just two damaged people acknowledging the damage and moving on. "I hope you and Lauren are happy," Ava said. "And I hope you've told her everything, not just about the tracking, but about the diary and the email monitoring and every other way you violated my privacy over the years. Because if you haven't, you're building a new marriage on the same foundation that destroyed ours." "I've told her everything," Jim said. "Every ugly detail. She knows exactly who I was and what I'm working on becoming." "Good," Ava said. "Then maybe you'll get it right this time." She drove back to her city feeling lighter, feeling like some weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. That evening she told David about the meeting, and he asked if she was okay, if seeing Jim had brought up difficult feelings, and Ava said honestly it hadn't been as hard as she'd expected. Jim had become someone from her past, instead of someone taking up space in her present, and that felt like healing. The apartment hunting continued, and they finally found a place that felt right. A 3-bedroom with a balcony and light that poured through windows, and enough space for all of them to have privacy. Her daughter picked out paint colors for her new room, and they spent weekends shopping for furniture together. And Ava watched her daughter get excited about this next chapter and felt grateful that children could be resilient when given the right support. Jim's mother called, asking if she and her husband could visit, wanting to see their granddaughter before the big move to the new apartment. Ava agreed, and they came for a weekend. And watching Jim's parents interact with her daughter, Ava felt complicated emotions. These people had raised the man who'd abused her, but they'd also been good grandparents and didn't deserve to lose their grandchild because their son was damaged. The visit went smoothly, and when they left, Jim's mother hugged Ava and said something unexpected. "I'm sorry my son hurt you. I'm sorry I didn't see the signs earlier and protect you better. You deserve more than what he gave you. It's not your fault," Ava said, and meant it. Jim made his choices. You didn't make them for him. Still, Jim's mother said, I raised him to be better than he was to you, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering where I went wrong. After they left, Ava thought about that conversation, about parents carrying the weight of their children's choices, about the ripples of damage spreading outward from Jim's surveillance to affect everyone in their orbit. She thought about her own daughter and promised herself she'd raise this girl to value trust and privacy, to never accept being monitored or controlled, to walk away from anyone who made her feel less than whole. The Women Artists exhibition closed after a successful run, and Ava immediately started planning the next project, the surveillance exhibition she'd discussed with the woman at David's party. She reached out to artists who'd experienced domestic surveillance and control, collected their work, built a show that was raw and honest and painful to look at. The gallery director approved the concept and gave Ava full creative control, and Ava threw herself into the work with fierce determination. One piece in particular struck her, a sculpture made entirely of broken GPS devices welded together into the shape of a cage. The artist had collected tracking devices from other survivors and created this memorial to freedom, and Ava stood in front of it for a long time, thinking about her own tracker sitting in an evidence box somewhere, thinking about how she should have kept it, should have turned it into art instead of letting it disappear into the legal system. She contacted the artist and asked if she could contribute a piece to the exhibition, and the artist said yes immediately, would be honored. So Ava created her first artwork, a digital installation showing her location data from the months before she discovered the tracker, animated dots moving across a map of her old city, grocery store to gallery, to her mother's house, to school, to park. She titled it Portrait of a Woman Who Didn't Know She Was Being Watched, and when she showed it to David, he held her hand and said it was powerful and brave and would help other women feel less alone. The surveillance exhibition opened and the response was overwhelming. Women came in crying, saying they saw themselves in the work, saying they'd found tracking devices in their own cars or discovered their partners monitoring their phones. Local domestic violence organizations set up information tables in the gallery. Media covered the exhibition extensively. Ava gave interviews about her own experience and watched her stories spread, watched other women respond with their own stories of surveillance and control and escape. Jim saw the exhibition mentioned online and texted, asking if she'd really put their private trauma on public display. And Ava responded that she'd put her trauma on display, that her experience belonged to her and she could do whatever she wanted with it, that his discomfort with people knowing what he'd done was not her problem to manage. He didn't respond, and she blocked his number, tired of giving him access to her emotional space. Through all of this, Ava's relationship with David deepened into something that felt permanent and real. They moved into the new apartment together and created routines that felt comfortable and healthy. David never once asked where Ava was going or checked her location or questioned her plans. He trusted her completely, and that trust felt like oxygen after years of being suffocated by Jim's suspicion. One evening, lying in bed, David asked Ava if she'd thought any more about marriage, and Ava said honestly she wasn't sure she ever wanted to be married again, that the institution felt tainted by her experience with Jim. David said he understood, and what mattered was building a life together regardless of legal status. And Ava fell more in love with him for not needing the validation of marriage to feel secure in their relationship. Her daughter adjusted well to the new apartment and seemed genuinely happy. Video calls with Jim continued regularly, and their daughter talked about his upcoming wedding and asked if she could be a flower girl. Ava said that was between her and her father, and she should ask him directly, refusing to control that relationship, even though part of her wanted to say no out of spite. Life settled into new patterns that felt sustainable and healthy. Work, David, her daughter, friends, art. The surveillance exhibition traveled to other cities, and Ava received speaking requests from universities and conferences. She was becoming, no, not just as a curator, but as a survivor who transformed her trauma into advocacy. And while that wasn't the career path, she'd imagined it felt meaningful in ways traditional curating never had. Ava stood on her balcony one morning, watching sunrise paint the sky, pink and orange, and thought about the woman she'd been when she found that tracker, thought about the fear and violation and rage that had nearly consumed her. That woman seemed like someone from another life, someone Ava barely recognized. She'd been forged in fire and come out steel, and while she'd never be grateful for what Jim had done, she could acknowledge that surviving it had transformed her into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined being. Chapter 9. The Revelation, the Four. Call came on a Thursday morning, while Ava was reviewing contracts for an upcoming acquisition. Her office door open, letting in sounds of the gallery coming alive with staff and early visitors. Her phone screen showed Jim's mother calling, and Ava almost declined, didn't want to deal with wedding planning or coordination of flower girl duties. But something made her answer, and immediately she knew from the breathing on the other end that something was wrong. "He's in the hospital," Jim's mother said without preamble, her voice wrecked and small. "Jim, he had some kind of breakdown. They're saying he tried to hurt himself. I'm here with him now, and Lauren is on her way, but I thought you should know. Because of your daughter. Because she'll need to know why this weekend's visit is cancelled." Ava sat down slowly, feeling the world tilt sideways. What happened? He stopped taking his medication. I don't know why. He told Lauren he felt like he didn't need it anymore, that he was doing so well. But then something triggered him, and he spiraled, and now we're here. And I don't know what to tell your daughter or how to explain this without terrifying her. Don't tell her anything yet, Ava said, her mind already racing through logistics and damage control. Let me figure out what to say and when to say it. How serious is this? Is he going to be okay? They're keeping him for observation, psychiatric hold. They're saying at least 72 hours, maybe longer, depending on his evaluation. Lauren is devastated. The wedding is supposed to be in 2 months, and now this, and I just don't understand how we got here. Ava closed her eyes and felt complicated things crash through her chest. Sympathy for Jim struggling with mental illness. Anger that his choice to stop medication had led to this crisis. Fear for how this would affect their daughter. And underneath everything, a cold understanding that this was what she'd escaped. This was the life she would have been living if she'd stayed, managing Jim's mental health crises while losing pieces of herself. I'm sorry this is happening, Ava said, meaning it. But Jim's mental health is not my responsibility anymore. You and Lauren will need to handle this. I'll tell my daughter that Daddy is sick and needs to rest, and we'll figure out visits once he's stable. That's all I can do. After hanging up, Ava sat in her office, staring at nothing, processing this new information and what it meant. Jim had been doing well, or seemed to be doing well, but apparently that had been medication and therapy holding back an ocean of dysfunction. What happened when he'd stopped taking his medication? Had he thought he was cured? Had he been arrogant enough to believe he'd fixed his broken brain through willpower alone? That evening, Ava sat down with her daughter and explained carefully that Daddy was sick and in the hospital, but he was safe and doctors were helping him feel better. Her daughter cried and asked if Daddy was going to die, and Ava held her and promised no, Daddy wasn't dying. He just needed help with his feelings, and sometimes people needed to go to the hospital for that kind of help. Is it because of the divorce? Her daughter asked. Is Daddy sad because you and him aren't together anymore? No, sweetheart. Daddy has an illness in his brain that makes him feel worried and scared sometimes, and he needs medicine to help his brain work better. This isn't about me or you or anything we did. This is just something Daddy has to manage, like someone with diabetes manages their blood sugar. David came over that night and held Ava while she cried for Jim and for their daughter, and for the years she'd spent trying to hold together a man who was fundamentally broken. She cried for the woman she'd been who'd thought love could fix mental illness, who'd absorbed Jim's anxiety as her responsibility, who'd let herself be surveilled and controlled because she believed he needed that to feel secure. "I could have ended up like Lauren," Ava said against David's shoulder. "If I'd stayed. If I'd believed Jim could change through love and willpower, I'd be the one in that hospital right now trying to convince him to keep taking his medication, managing his mental health like it was my job, slowly drowning while pretending everything was fine." But you didn't stay," David said. "You chose yourself. You chose freedom." "I chose survival," Ava said. "And I'm not sure that makes me brave or just selfish." "It makes you human," David said. "You can't save someone who's drowning if you're drowning too. You had to swim to shore first." Jim stayed in the hospital for a week, then was transferred to a residential treatment facility for intensive therapy and medication management. Lauren postponed the wedding indefinitely, and Jim's mother called. Ava crying, saying she didn't know if Lauren would stay or leave. Didn't know if Jim would ever be stable enough to have a normal life. Ava listened and made sympathetic sounds, but kept her boundaries firm, refused to be drawn back into managing Jim's crisis. Video calls with their daughter were suspended while Jim was in treatment, and Ava watched her daughter struggle with the absence of her father, with the fear that he might not get better, with the confusion of mental illness that was too complex for a child to fully understand. Ava got her daughter into therapy, and the therapist helped her process the fear and guilt, helped her understand that her father's illness wasn't her fault and wasn't something she could fix. Weeks passed and Jim completed his treatment program and was released with new medication and a strict outpatient therapy schedule. Lauren had stayed, but had put the wedding on hold indefinitely, saying they needed to see Jim maintain stability before making permanent commitments. Video calls with their daughter resumed, and Jim looked different on screen, flatter somehow, like the medication had smoothed out his emotions along with his anxiety. Their daughter asked Ava if Daddy seemed different, and Ava said yes. Medication sometimes did that, made people seem less like themselves but also less sick. She explained that Daddy had to choose between being the person he was with illness or the person he was with medication, and sometimes that was a hard choice, but it was the right one if it kept him safe. The surveillance exhibition traveled to a major museum in another city, and Ava was invited to speak at the opening. She stood in front of hundreds of people and told her story publicly for the first time. The full story, including the diary and the tracking and the years of surveillance. She talked about the choice to leave, the choice to prosecute or not prosecute, the choice to forgive or stay angry. She talked about transformation through trauma and the power of claiming your own narrative. After the talk, women lined up to speak with her, sharing their own stories of surveillance and control and escape. Some were still in their situations, too afraid or financially trapped to leave. Some had left and were rebuilding. Some were years into healing and wanted to thank Ava for making them feel less alone. Ava listened to each story and gave each woman her card, told them to reach out if they ever needed resources or just someone who understood. Flying home that night, Ava thought about Jim in his treatment facility, learning to manage his mental illness. Thought about Lauren choosing to stay despite seeing the full extent of his dysfunction. Thought about their daughter learning to love a father who was fundamentally unreliable. She thought about the choice she'd made to leave, the choice that had saved her life and her sanity and her daughter's chance at seeing what healthy love looked like. David picked her up from the airport and they drove home together. And Ava told him about the talk and the women who'd shared their stories, and David said he was proud of her for turning her pain into purpose. That night, lying in bed, Ava said something she'd been thinking about for months. I don't want to get married, but I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and make decisions together and be a family with my daughter. I want commitment without the institution that represents my trauma. Is that enough for you?" David pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "That's everything. The paper doesn't matter. What we're building together matters, and I'll take what we have over a marriage certificate any day." Ava felt something release in her chest, some final piece of fear that David would need traditional markers of commitment to feel secure. She'd found someone who trusted her completely, who didn't need to track or monitor or control, who loved her for exactly who she was, including all the damage Jim had caused. Jim's visits with their daughter resumed. First supervised again until the court was satisfied he was stable, then gradually back to regular overnight visits with strict medication compliance requirements. Their daughter reported that Daddy seemed quieter now, less fun than before, but also less scary, more predictable. Ava accepted this as the trade-off of mental illness management, knew there was no perfect solution, just choices between different kinds of difficult. One afternoon, Ava received a message from Lauren asking if they could meet again, and when they sat down at the same coffee shop, Lauren looked exhausted, older than she had months earlier. "I'm thinking about leaving," Lauren said without preamble. "Not because Jim relapsed or broke my boundaries, because I realized I signed up to love someone, not to manage someone's mental illness for the rest of my life, and I don't think I can do this." "Then don't," Ava said simply. "You don't owe him your life just because he's sick." "But he's trying so hard," Lauren said. "He's taking his medication, going to therapy, doing everything right. How can I leave someone who's doing everything right?" Ava looked at this woman, who was learning the same lesson Ava had learned years earlier, that doing everything right doesn't erase the fundamental incompatibility between who you are and what someone else needs. Because doing everything right doesn't mean you're obligated to stay. Because mental illness isn't his fault, but managing it is his responsibility, not yours. Because you can care about someone and still choose not to spend your life as their caretaker. "I learned all of this too late. You're learning it early enough to save yourself," Lauren cried, and Ava held her hand across the table and thought about the strange sisterhood of women who'd loved Jim and been damaged by him in different ways. When Lauren left, she looked lighter, like she'd been given permission to choose herself, and Ava hoped she'd actually do it, instead of falling back into the trap of believing love required sacrifice. 2 weeks later, Jim's mother called to say Lauren had ended the engagement, had moved out, had told Jim she couldn't be what he needed. Jim was devastated but stable, still taking his medication, still attending therapy, accepting the end with more grace than he'd accepted the divorce. Ava felt relief that Lauren had chosen herself, felt hope that maybe Jim was actually learning that his needs couldn't be met by sacrificing other people's well-being. The surveillance exhibition received national attention, and galleries in multiple cities requested to host it. Ava's work expanded beyond curating into advocacy and speaking, and she was invited to consult on legislation about domestic surveillance and digital privacy. Her career transformed into something she'd never imagined but felt deeply meaningful, using her experience to create change for other women. Through all of this, David remained steady and supportive, never jealous of Ava's success or threatened by her growing profile. He showed up to her speaking events and cheered her on and took care of their daughter when Ava traveled. He proved daily that healthy love looked like support without possession, like trust without surveillance, like partnership between equals. Ava stood on stage at a conference about domestic violence and technology abuse, speaking to an audience of hundreds of advocates and survivors and professionals, and she realized she'd become someone she never expected to be. Not just a survivor, but a voice for other survivors. Not just someone who'd escaped, but someone who'd transformed escape into advocacy. Not just someone who'd been tracked, but someone who'd turned that tracking device into a symbol of resistance. And as she spoke about finding that tracker at 2 in the morning, about sending it to Canada, about watching Jim's world crumble when he couldn't control her anymore. Ava felt powerful in a way she'd never felt during the marriage. She'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into fuel for helping others. She'd survived, and then she'd thrived, and then she'd used her thriving to light the way for women still trapped in darkness. Chapter 10. The Liberation. 3 years after finding the tracker under her car, Ava stood in front of a museum case containing that very device, now part of a permanent collection on surveillance and domestic control, and she looked at the small black object that had changed her entire life and felt something close to gratitude. Not for what Jim had done, never for that, but for the woman she'd become through surviving it. The museum had purchased the device from police evidence, and Ava had worked with curators to create an exhibit explaining its significance. The placard read simply, "GPS tracking device used by husband to monitor wife's location without consent. Sent by wife to Canada as act of resistance. Symbol of surveillance culture in intimate relationships, and one woman's refusal to remain. Pray." Her daughter stood next to her, looking at the tracker with the complicated expression of someone who understood this object represented both her mother's trauma and her family's dissolution. She was older now, more aware, processing the divorce with the help of therapy and time. "Do you wish you'd never found it?" her daughter asked quietly. Ava considered the question carefully. If she'd never found the tracker, she might still be married, might still be living in comfortable ignorance of Jim's surveillance, might still be the woman who prioritized peace over truth. But that woman had been slowly dying inside. "No," Ava said. "Finding it set me free. It hurt, and it was hard, and it changed everything. But I wouldn't trade who I am now for who I was then." They walked through the rest of the exhibition together, past artwork from other survivors, past statistics about domestic surveillance, past resources for women in controlling relationships. When they reached the exit, her daughter turned and hugged Ava tight. "I'm glad you left," her daughter whispered. "I'm glad you chose us over him." Ava held her daughter and felt tears she didn't try to hide. This was the validation she'd needed but hadn't asked for. Confirmation that leaving had been right, not just for her, but for their daughter too. David was waiting outside, and they walked to a nearby park where they'd planned a picnic. The three of them spread a blanket and ate sandwiches and laughed about nothing important. Ava watched David interact with her daughter, watched the easy affection between them, watched her daughter feel safe and happy in this constructed family they'd built from the ruins of the old one. Jim video called right on schedule, and their daughter moved away to talk privately. Ava no longer monitored these calls, trusted her daughter to maintain her own boundaries. Jim was stable now, consistently medicated, working steadily, living alone. He dated occasionally, but nothing serious. Seemed resigned to managing his mental illness rather than pretending it didn't exist. When the call ended, their daughter came back and reported that Daddy had asked about the museum exhibition, had seen it mentioned online, and wanted to know if his name was attached to it. Ava had deliberately kept Jim's identity anonymous in all her public speaking and advocacy work. She'd done this partly to protect their daughter, but mostly because she refused to give him the infamy he might want. "What did you tell him?" Ava asked. "That you never used his name, that you protected him even though you didn't have to?" "He said to tell you thank you." Ava felt something complicated move through her chest. Jim's gratitude felt both appropriate and insufficient. She hadn't protected him out of kindness, but out of strategic choice, maintaining control of her own narrative. But she accepted his thanks anyway, another small piece of closure. That evening the gallery hosted a reception for donors and board members, and Ava moved through the crowd, feeling confident and powerful. The board chair pulled her aside and officially offered her the executive director position. Ava accepted without hesitation, ready to lead the institution into new territory. After the reception, David took her home, and they stood on their balcony, looking at city lights, and David said something that made Ava's breath catch. "I want to adopt her, your daughter." If you and she are comfortable with it, I want to legally be her father. Not to replace Jim, but to acknowledge what we've built together." Ava turned to face him and saw sincerity and love and commitment that had nothing to do with control. She thought about her daughter who called David by his first name, but looked to him for advice and comfort. She thought about the family they'd created through intention rather than biology. "I need to talk to her about it," Ava said. "And to Jim. Everyone affected needs to have a voice." They brought it up with their daughter the next weekend, and she cried happy tears and said yes immediately. Said David had been more of a father to her over the past years than Jim had been even before the divorce. They called Jim together and explained the situation, and Jim was quiet for a long time before saying he understood. He wouldn't fight it. He knew David had been there in ways he hadn't been able to be. The adoption process moved forward, and on the day it was finalized, they celebrated with cake, and their daughter asked if she could change her last name to include both her fathers, hyphenating Martin and David's last name together. Ava said that was entirely her choice, and watching her daughter claim both identities felt like the perfect symbol of healing. Ava received an invitation to speak at a conference overseas about digital privacy and intimate partner violence, and she accepted. Standing on stage in front of an international audience, Ava told her story and watched it translated into multiple languages, watched women from different countries nod in recognition. After the talk, a woman approached and handed Ava a small wrapped package. Inside was a necklace made from a smashed GPS tracker. The broken pieces formed into something beautiful and defiant. The woman explained she was an artist who'd experienced similar surveillance, who destroyed her tracker and made jewelry from it as reclamation of power. Ava put on the necklace and wore it for the rest of the conference, a visible symbol of transformation. Back home, Ava returned to work energized and full of plans. The gallery expanded its programming around surveillance culture, partnered with domestic violence organizations, created scholarships for artists addressing intimate partner abuse. Ava's advocacy work grew alongside her curatorial work until they became inseparable. One evening, Ava stood in her home office looking at the wall where she'd hung framed articles about her work, speaking engagements, the museum exhibition. On her desk sat the necklace made from the broken tracker and her laptop where she was writing a book about her experience, turning years of trauma into testimony that might help other women. David came in and wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together, looking at everything Ava had created. She leaned back against him and felt safe in a way she'd never felt with Jim, felt trusted in a way she'd thought was impossible. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never found the tracker?" David asked. Ava thought about the woman she'd been, slowly suffocating under Jim's observation, losing pieces of herself to maintain a marriage that was killing her. "I would have died," Ava said simply. "Not physically, maybe, but everything that made me who I am would have eroded away. Finding the tracker saved my life." Years continued passing, and Ava's life expanded in ways she'd never imagined. Her book was published and became required reading in domestic violence training programs. She consulted on legislation about digital surveillance. She spoke at universities and conferences. She built a career and a family and a life that was entirely her own. And sometimes, late at night, Ava would think about that tracker, about finding it at 2 a.m. on a driveway under stars, about the choice she'd made in that moment to fight instead of break. She'd think about sending it to Canada, watching Jim's face drain of color, methodically destroying his control while building her own power. That woman had been forged in fire and emerged as steel. That woman had taken the worst betrayal and turned it into fuel for revolution. That woman had proven that victims could become victors, that prey could become predators, that love without trust wasn't love at all, but imprisonment disguised as devotion. Ava stood on her balcony, watching dawn break over the city, drinking coffee, planning her day, living her completely autonomous life. She thought about all the women still finding trackers under their cars, still discovering surveillance, still making the choice between staying and leaving. She thought about her story reaching them, giving them permission to choose themselves. And Ava smiled, knowing that the greatest revenge wasn't making Jim suffer, but becoming so magnificent in her freedom that his surveillance seemed pathetic in retrospect. She'd won not by destroying him, but by building something so beautiful from the ashes that everyone could see what he'd tried to prevent. She'd turned a GPS tracker into a symbol of resistance and herself into proof that women who refuse to remain prey become absolutely unstoppable. The sun rose golden over the city, and Ava raised her coffee cup in a toast to the woman she'd been, the woman she'd become, and all the women who would find trackers tomorrow and choose freedom instead of fear. She'd survived and thrived and transformed, and nothing Jim had done could ever take that away. She was finally completely, gloriously free.